All right. Great. So Elizabeth, did you wanted to talk about Room in the Inn, right?
Yes, so I'm on the Missions and Outreach Committee, and we've been asked to consider signing up for Room in the Inn for one of the, I'm sure people are familiar, but Wednesday nights from now until like April, West End holds Room in the Inn pretty regularly on Wednesday evenings, and typically Sunday school classes sign up to host one of those weeks. And Stacy implored us to sign up for one if we are willing.
What is it?
Room in the Inn is a program where I think homeless people who have who are in pretty heavy labor work environments come here and spend the night and get dinner, and then also breakfast and lunches to go, which they take with them to work. So the roles that people would need to sign up for include preparing food, so that would be dinner, breakfast, and lunch. Those are all different people. You don't have to do all of those things, but bus drivers, if anybody is interested in that. Someone has to drive the bus to go pick up the guys and then bring them here, and then in the morning take them back. People to stay overnight. I think a couple overnight hosts, which I believe, Brandon, do you know, don't they have to be men, or at least one has to be a man?
I think we usually host men here, so I think
Yeah.
typically it seems to be men that stay here overnight. But you'd have to check with Stacy to
I think Stacy told me
verify
that at least one has, they can't be only women doing the overnight.
Yeah, it's probably at least one male, because I think we host males typically.
And then making the beds and serving food, that kind of stuff. So there are all these different roles that you can sign up for. So I guess the first step would be if people are interested, then we can either talk about dates, I have the list of available dates, or I can send out a doodle poll and then we can vote on what you would prefer. So first, I guess if they're interested in doing that as a class.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important if we're going to uphold the Benton's legacy that we step up. And,
That's right. That's right. Uphold the Benton class legacy and step up.
Well, since we're missing people today, I wonder if a doodle would be easier. Would you prefer to kind of vote on dates that way, or would you rather talk about them?
Yeah. And
Okay.
then after dates, we decide on
Roles.
Okay.
Yeah.
bus driver.
You have to go to the bus driver training if you want to be the bus driver.
Exactly.
That's true. You gotta, which basically means you get to come up here, Gabe, and ride around the parking lot with Matt Phelps, I think.
And then I can drive us to the park.
Yeah, then you can drive us anywhere.
Drive us anywhere.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. Good. So yeah, I do think helping Room in the Inn is great, and we do have some open slots right now. So if this class is willing to do that for a week, that would be phenomenal. The more groups that help, the better, and it makes us able to host for the whole entirety of the Room in the Inn season, which is basically the winter months, if the weather ever changes. Heck, right now I'd want to get off the streets because it's so hot.
Yeah.
So either way, I think that's a good thing, and so I know Stacy would appreciate your help if you're willing to do that. So that's great. All right. Any other announcements or anything we need to know before we get going?
There are donuts over there, so.
Donuts over there. Selby wants to make sure you know that the donuts are over there, so eat them. And there's apparently one that tastes. Did you already eat the one that tastes like Fruity Pebbles?
No, but I ate the one with the powder and it went. I'm a mess. It's like all over me. So don't eat the powdered one.
Well, I might get one while y'all are chatting a bit. So great. So last week, if you weren't able to be here last week, let me just give you a brief, 3-minute overview of kind of what we did last week. Last week I had Bibles spread out around the room, and I asked people to kind of go through the book of Luke and literally thumb through that book and see if they could find some of the different sections, what they saw going on in there. It's not like we read the whole book, but we looked at some of the headings and things like that and discovered some of the things that were going on in the book of Luke. And then I passed around later an outline after we kind of did our own outline to a degree. I passed around an outline that showed that the whole book of Luke is set up in about 5 sections. It can be divided up different ways, but I'm using the work of one guy who has studied the book of Luke for a long time. And he kind of divides it up into 5 sections, which starts with the beginning, or Luke's preface, the intro of John and Jesus, and then the preparation for ministry, and where Jesus is kind of anointed by God for Jesus' work. And then there's this time for about 5 chapters where Jesus does all this ministry in Galilee. But then the 4th section is when Jesus turns and sets his face to Jerusalem. And that's where he makes this final journey along with anybody who wants to follow to Jerusalem. And then I think the group over here last week looked at the last section where they said it, and that's where everything kind of picks up steam. So, so there's kind of this 10-chapter section called the Luke travel narrative. And we're looking at lessons for discipleship from that particular section. So it's between Luke 9 and 19. And last week we looked at the very beginning. And we saw that in the first verses there, starting with 9:51, that Jesus is kind of talking to his followers about things like, we're going to have to go pretty immediately now. We're doing this thing. We're going to have to go to different towns and move through these towns. And if they accept us, great, and we can share our message. If they don't accept us, what did they say? Does anybody remember? If they don't accept us, we're going to do what with our feet?
Shake the dust off our feet.
That's right. Shake the dust off our feet. That's right. So we talked a little bit about that kind of notion of they're on the move and they're trying to share this different message of Jesus. And Jesus challenges them that sometimes you're not going to be received, but shake the dust off your feet if you're not. If you are received, though, he said, go and stay in the home, share the message, do everything I'm asking you to do, all of this kind of stuff. So it was kind of just an intro to what it was to get on the road with Jesus. Throughout the course of this fall, starting a few weeks ago, we've been preaching out of the book of Luke as well. I don't know if you've noticed that, but all of the preaching we've been doing is also all on the road. So it's all from this section between 9 and 19. So as we started to work together, I thought, wouldn't it be nice to look at some window to get some idea about what it is to be a disciple through some of the things that Jesus does and says on this road trip or on this journey. So today we're going to look very specifically at one set of passages. We're not going to go through the whole breadth again. We've done that. We kind of understand where we are in the book of Luke. But what we're going to look at today is we are going to look at the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer actually shows up in two places. It shows up in the book of Matthew and also in the book of Luke. And in a few minutes, we're going to look at those two versions and kind of see what might feel different and what might be similar. But before we do that, I want to invite you into some discussion for a few minutes. Let's do this in two big groups today. So maybe from like Katie here, if y'all make a little circle over here, and maybe from Elizabeth here, y'all make a circle here. And I want you to answer 3 questions, and I'll write them up here for you. So the first one, and take about 3 minutes for each one. And there are no right or wrong answers to this. So the first thing is, what is prayer? The second one is, what is the purpose of prayer? And the third is, how does or does not prayer factor into your own life right now? Okay? And be honest. Be honest with yourselves about that. So about 3 minutes on each of these, then we're going to do some sharing out loud as a big group. But kind of huddle up, circle up, and get to it. I'll finish writing these up on the board here. Just the basic question. What is prayer? I'll tell you when you should move to the next one.
Yes.
I know you're like there's so many.
It's like a connection, but it's
Yeah.
I mean, is it all familiar with God?
My work issue or something
Right.
trivial.
Right.
It's
It seems
like
when there's
like
like
the now
flooding
sleep.
not
Yeah.
really actually
Right.
my soul to keep. But it's like more
Okay.
that in general.
Yes.
Your first world problem.
It's comforting. It is
Yeah.
like a connection, but it's not
Yeah.
like,
Son,
dear God, like
So-
please
Yeah.
this and that.
It's more than
Yeah.
meditative piece.
Yeah.
Pray about their problems.
Yeah.
Maybe like a therapy,
And you have
somebody to
when
talk
my wife
to.
and like you should just really pray on it. Just, have you prayed about it?
Yeah.
I'm like,
No.
I was getting to that. And I fell asleep.
then I feel so.
That's my mom. Like,
At least for me.
that's my mom. She's that
Sometimes I
like.
pray for the same things. The same
I guess it always seems, I don't know if this is gonna slap at your mom, but it seems like a
ritual.
hokey thing to like.
That's what it is. How you
All right, as you're feeling it, move on to what is the purpose of prayer. What is the purpose?
I think that's
of
prayer.
prayer?
The asking, what I was gonna say on the asking thing, I realized that was a total law nerd moment, but that if you read old cases, it is called a prayer for relief when you're asking for something. So forever, like the word
I forget
itself
where.
in the law was always asking for things. So
Lotus thing. Okay, so they said acts. So, acknowledgement. So that's what prayer is supposed to include. And that's an acronym. Yeah. So it's.
Adoration or acknowledgement,
Yep.
Christian, thanksgiving, supplication.
Supplication.
Those are really good words.
Asking is really,
Really far reaching to come up with acts.
So acknowledging that God is over everything.
Do we think the purpose is to like do we think of it more as one way meditation or two-way dialogue?
See, confession is
Try to use
here
it
are my
as an
sins.
opportunity to
I'm sorry
think
for
back.
them.
I have some friends that are like
They are.
a little more into
He is.
and I will use it as an opportunity to just like
That's the
pray on
thing.
something and hope to like hear an
And
answer,
then
which is
supplication.
Meditation.
like your
Asking for God. And
I
that's
know.
like the themes of what I
Yeah,
would
that's
the
right.
Lord's
It's hard to.
Prayer.
It
It's
isn't
like,
just asking.
you know,
It's
help us to
get some
Yeah. Give us our daily bread. That's another key thing to ask for. It's something as menial as daily bread. Like,
Yeah.
you don't get
How
many
does it,
meals.
does it not?
You know, with floods and.
Well, I
Right.
fall asleep, so if I'm just being honest.
So I think that's part of the problem with the meditative thing,
Yeah.
right?
Well, no,
It's
yeah,
like
it's not to say
I
it's
think-
like easy to do, but also easy to
Right, that's
forget.
fine.
It doesn't have to be this whole,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be all the time, you could do it while
The
you're
mode
driving.
of
just be like,
communication.
oh,
Yeah.
Because like prayer is talking to God.
Mhm.
I don't actually have to say things to even my best friend to communicate
Yeah.
what it is that's going on, right?
Like
Yeah.
growing up.
So maybe it's
Same.
communication.
Do like the now.
Yeah, and
However
the
you
same
like
thing
the
is true with God.
To that
What's the
and
quote like?
definitely
Rose
like went to
too
college
deep for
and stuff,
words
like
or
100%
something.
like did not keep doing that. You know, just like
People
was doing my
express
What's that
thing, and
acronym?
now like I got it.
I don't know what it's from, but
Yeah, and think about
but
like
it literally just means like when you're at a
you know,
loss
pieces
for
of
words,
routine.
like that is also
Yeah, like it's good
communicating
like
with
it's
God.
also
All right, as you're feeling good, move on to how does or does not prayer factor into your own life?
Well, kind of what we're talking about.
I'm the world's worst at
it's maybe good
actual
because
sitting
you
down.
just start like going through the motions and saying the same thing every time. You do it when you're
But
really.
I can write things
Yeah.
down much more easily, or I can
yeah,
just
and I think it's
be
interesting. Maybe this is
intentional
like kind of circling back to the
I
first
actually
question
care
itself,
about
but
this person. I'm gonna take a moment out of my day to stop
Like, if
and
you just
consider what that person's doing.
are saying something like
Mhm.
And I
like when you're driving, like oh God, there's things
out loud.
that
Yeah.
whatever,
And you find
like
that
10
you're-
seconds, like did you just
Which one you
pray
say about what
or
you're
were you
praying.
just
Yeah.
So you don't pray for,
saying, you know,
yeah,
you're saying like
you don't say that in front of your
something.
children.
Kind of all the same
You
thing,
know, or
as
I
long as
do.
you're making some sort of connection
But saying it out loud kind of makes,
and it's comforting to you.
well, first in you're awake because you're holding it.
Everyone does it
right?
in some way, I guess.
Yeah.
But also it makes you kind of focus more positively and not as far
Like
for so
5
much.
Mhm.
With
Got a lot of coffee this morning and an apple fritter. Like I always felt weird closing my eyes during
Which is
prayer,
nice.
like at church,
And then I guess when you do
even
your
now,
silent
just
prayer,
like feels really weird.
on your own,
And
that's
so
a little deeper,
I used to
heavier.
get worried that it wasn't praying if my eyes were closed. But it doesn't really matter because I'm just doing whatever works for me and that's cool. So like there's not like a specific. Yeah.
It is interesting to watch.
Right.
As a fellow eye opener during prayer in church, you can look around and like
So.
What's weird is like someone's giving a blessing, like at the table, and everyone's sitting around, like, you know, their heads are bowed, and you're just like,
maybe I should
Yeah,
have
yeah.
effort into it, but that's how it initially feels. But that's why I'm trying to almost say like, oh, how can I make
All
this
right.
like 2 weeks?
So let me kind of pull you back to to your attention being focused this direction. You can stay in your circles for a minute because you might be able to feed off one another since you had different discussions in your two groups. So what is prayer then? What did your groups say prayer was? What were some of the things that came out? Either group can start.
Well, we talked about it in a couple different ways. One being a connection between God and self,
Okay.
and the other being more of a meditative experience.
Okay, so connection between God and self, and then also a meditative experience. What's the difference between those two in your group's thinking? I'm just curious.
Selby, do you want to talk about the meditative?
sure. We just kind of talked about, like, one is like if you are actually are like sitting down, like talking to God, like there's this like purpose, you have your eyes closed, you're kind of doing your own thing, and then there's also just like, if you're driving in your car and you're just like, oh, like, kind of like thinking through things like, dear God, this, that, or whatever, and then it's 10 seconds or something,
Right.
but that was like comforting to you, and you didn't have, there's no like formula for it,
Gotcha.
and so kind of the difference between.
So maybe in this first one, the connection thing, there's kind of an intentional
Like you're asking
thinking
for
about
something.
I am communicating with God.
Yeah.
Whereas the meditative experience may be a little more getting in the flow,
Yeah.
so to speak. Okay. I actually use the word flow. Richard Rohr. I don't know. Does anybody here read any Richard Rohr? I bet Jeff reads Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr. Sometimes he is a Catholic priest and Franciscan monk who writes all about the inner journey, the inward journey. He writes a lot about prayer, but he also writes about its connection to our faith life lived out here too. But he has taken in the later part of his years has taken to talking a lot about the flow, using the same language that people like athletes and other people, that language has become common, that when you're in the zone, that you're kind of in the flow of things. He thinks that sometimes when you're really connected at that inner space, when you are connecting, and what he would say connecting with God in here, that you sometimes are in the flow. So that's why I used that word there. So intentional. What about the other group? Did y'all have anything to add to what prayer is?
No, we kind of stole our answers.
They still your answers. There's nothing different?
We really did say meditation and talking to God.
Okay, great.
You know, it's funny though. So English major. We started by saying, I said talking to God, but then as we were discussing, in my mind, I sort of amended that language to communicating with.
Okay, communicate.
So and we talked about sometimes it feels like you're talking to and not communicating with, and so what that feels like, but it's probably like a sub-bullet of the first one.
Yeah,
Just
so
what that
so communicating with,
with.
what you might even borrow from our church language and just say communing with.
There you go.
And that kind of gets between, communing is the nice in-between space between this and the flow, right? It's intentional, but it also recognizes that God's up to something too, and that it's not a one-way experience, and it's not just, sometimes I think thinking about just meditative experience can become more about just us. It can be that, it doesn't have to be, but it can be that. But meditative prayer might be something more like communing, so I like that. So what's the purpose of prayer then? Y'all had that question too. What do you think? Purpose of prayer?
One of the things, y'all go ahead. We stole your thunder last time.
Yeah, okay.
Really, I was going to throw it straight to Caroline. She gave this amazing acronym, and I was like,
You also heard that.
What was the acronym we used?
It's ACTS.
The ACTS, yeah. Adoration. Give it to me.
Confession,
Confession.
thanksgiving,
Thanksgiving.
and supplication.
And supplication. Anybody want to explain what supplication is?
Asking.
Okay. So Acts, this is like a very formulaic way that sometimes people are taught to think about prayer. It's also a way that some people are guided through. And when I say formulaic, I don't necessarily mean that's bad.
Right.
In fact, in a few minutes when we look at the Lord's Prayer, it's a very formulaic prayer. We're going to talk about the formula of the Lord's Prayer. But this is one way that sometimes, especially young people kind of going through confirmation and stuff like that are taught, because it's easy to remember. It's got that nice acronym. But I'm glad you said it out to me, because I wasn't sure I'd remember all the letters myself. So I remembered adoration right away, but I was like, yeah, you help me out here. That's right. But yeah, so adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. What else? What else did we hear? What is the purpose of prayer?
So we did kind of talk a lot about the asking, because you had an English nerd major. I had a law nerd major that when you read really old cases, it is called the prayer for relief at the end. So what you are asking for is your prayer for relief. So at some point in history, it was a synonym.
Huh.
So
prayer for relief, and that was actually in the law.
Well, that's like, what do I want? I want money. That's my prayer for relief at the end of the case. So they took that asking in the prayer.
It's interesting that you say that, because a lot of times people don't like people that grow up in traditions like ours, where we say, because we're talking about the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. In some traditions, that is translated as what?
Debts.
Yes, debts. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and in some ways, I think we've lost something by not using that translation, because that puts it on the ground. I mean, a prayer for relief, like, I've been hurt here. I actually need to be remunerated. I need money, and I don't think that's all that prayer should be about, but sometimes I kind of like that. I like sometimes hearing the Lord's Prayer with the debtors thing, because it reminds me, especially when we live in a culture that is built around debt. I mean, basically, we all live now with lots and lots of debt. Now, some of it may be positive debt. We call it positive debt, but it's debt. So what does it mean to then say a prayer that talks about debting? So I love that this connection to law language of asking and that kind of stuff. Anything else that came out about the purpose of prayer?
Well, the word intentional was said by your group and our group, and so I think part of it is an intentional space made in your time or day, or even just like consciousness to connect with God.
That's great. Intentional.
Or commune.
Right. Or commune, that's right. So, now the hardest question. How does prayer function in your own life? Does it figure in? Does it not? Quasi? What were some of the answers?
We mentioned that it's something that's easy to do, but also easy to forget.
Okay.
And so, it doesn't have to be this long, go sit in a room. I mean, it can be, but, you could do it in your car. Like, you could take 30 seconds in the morning. It's kind of what works for you. But it's also easy to forget. You might go a while and be like, wow, I haven't really thought about this.
So easy to do, but also easy to forget. What else? What else came up?
I feel like personally, because I've always been taught or heard about the formula, it can become redundant and almost something I don't want to do, because it's boring and doesn't seem to reap a benefit sometimes. I know that sounds terrible, but
I think it's good to be honest about those things. Can be redundant, or can be boring, can be, one of the great things is that there are many, 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 many ways to commune with God. And sometimes what you need to do to spice up your prayer life is to try different ways of prayer. I'm actually doing a little 3-week workshop on Wednesday nights right now with a group of people. And we started out the first week trying some different things, like different ways of reading the Bible, of centering, doing some of the quiet things. But then last week, I said, when you come back next week, the room's going to be set up totally different. It's going to be a totally different thing. And Edgar Lowe, does anybody know Edgar Lowe? He's one of our older gentlemen that goes here. Anyway, Edgar Lowe was talking with some of his friends down at Wednesday night dinner, and he said, I think Brandon's going to make us handle snakes tonight. they came in, and I had art stations set up, and we used prayer. I mean, we used visual art and poetry and music as inroads into communing with God that week. Getting out and doing things are ways of praying. There are all sorts of ways to allow yourself to commune or connect with God. And so when prayer starts to feel formulaic or boring the way you've been doing it, sometimes it might be that you need to try some new things, to allow yourself to get back into that flow, so to speak. So I appreciate that, actually, that it can become redundant. You know, it's interesting. That's why, as we dig into the Lord's Prayer for a few minutes today, we're digging into something that we say every week, and it becomes completely rote to us, just like most of our liturgy in church, especially at a church like this where we're high liturgy. We are saying things all the time and not really thinking about it. We're just doing it. And so sometimes also it can be good to rethink, why do we do this, or what is this about? Good. Anything else that you all said that in terms of how prayer is related to your own life right now?
Will you talk about your time with your son?
So I was saying we started praying with our son, and you do it out loud, and you're awake because it's early. You're not laying in your own bed, and I kind of second guess the things that I pray about are like heavier, more serious things. But when we're with him, it's just thank you God for my family, thank you for my toys, thank you for my bed, and it's there's more gratitude, and there's less praying for sad things or
like that.
To protect him. Of course, we just don't pray about that stuff. We just teach him to talk to God. But it just kind of made me think of I do the happy, grateful prayer with him, and then please keep us from getting sick, and please everything else later in private. So it just the purpose of it kind of changed with him.
Yeah, so sometimes praying with a child then opened your eyes to kind of the thankful side, the just coming to God with a heart open to give thanks and to be in God's presence. That is the beauty of real meditative prayer too, is coming to God without all the petitions. Nothing wrong with prayers that have petitions, but we also sometimes just need to be in the presence of God too. And some of all of that shows up in the Lord's Prayer, I would suggest. So if you'll kind of back up into your big circle, we're going to do the rest of our work today together as one group. Excellent work, excellent work. So in the book of Luke, we have moved a couple of chapters down from where we started last week. Actually, just one chapter really from where we started last week, because we started with 9:51, but we moved to the beginning of chapter 10. And then there are some of these things that happen. Jesus does some exorcisms, foretells his death. He tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then the very last thing that happens before we get to this section is that Jesus, there's that story about Jesus with Martha and Mary, where Martha and Mary are, one of them's going around and preparing the house, and the other one's sitting with Jesus. And that's a very complicated story that Carol preached on recently very well, and I'm not going to go into detail about it right now. But all of these different encounters Jesus is having with different people at various needs. Men, women, all sorts of different people. And then he gets to this place in 11 where he says, where it says he was praying in a certain place, and after he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray as John taught his disciples." And then he said to them, "When you pray, you say this." And he gives them this prayer for the road. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, this prayer is actually also found in a certain part of the book of Matthew. And there are some similarities, but there are some differences too. I put the two side by side on your chair. Now, the translation that you've got in your hands is actually from one of the newest translations of the Bible called the Common English Bible. So the words still may not, even from the Matthew version, may not sound as familiar to you. But I was wondering if I could get two people that are willing to read out loud. One to read the Matthew version from 9 to 13, and the other to read the Luke version from 1 to 4. Anybody willing to do that? Okay, somebody will read one. Who will read the other? All right,
The other one.
Richard will read the other one. All right, why don't you give us the Matthew one then, Sylvia?
Pray like this. Our Father who is in heaven, uphold the holiness of your name. Bring in your kingdom so that your will is done on earth as it's done in heaven. Give us the bread we need for today. Forgive us for the ways we have wronged you, just as we also forgive those who have wronged us. And don't lead us into temptation, but rescue us from the evil one.
Great. And now, Richard, if you read the other one.
Okay. You just said 1 through 4, correct?
Yes, just 1 through 4.
Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples. Jesus told them, when you pray, say, Father, uphold the holiness of your name, bring in your kingdom, give us the bread we need for today, forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who has wronged us, and don't lead us into temptation.
All right. So, what do we have? What are the minor differences between these two? What are some of the things you see that are different between one and the other?
I mean, it's the same thing, but the wording is different.
Okay, same thing basically.
Same like general premise.
Okay, same general premise, wording a little bit different. You feel like anything major's missing?
Matthew's is much more in depth. The Luke one leaves out the so that your will is done on earth as it's done in heaven.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting because, you know, we talked about how Luke is actually very concerned with the poor and the marginalized and these things. And so, so at first I was like, isn't it weird that Luke doesn't say this other flowery stuff? But then I realized that Luke just says what? Quite simply.
Bring in your kingdom.
Yeah,
period.
just bring it. Bring in your kingdom. You know, just like, let's rebuild this thing. So, so Luke leaves "Thy will be done" out, but he does kind of have this really strong, like, yeah, just bring in your kingdom. You know, this is what needs to happen. So he uses that straight up kingdom language very clearly. Anything else that seems to be missing or that's different?
Matthew has a very specific acknowledgement. We have wronged you.
Okay.
That Luke doesn't include.
Right. Matthew acknowledges we have wronged you. What does Luke say there, or not say there? What's that section read like in Luke?
He just says sins. So he's implied that we've wronged you with using sin.
Yeah, so forgive us our sins, yes. And we could get into, you know, we could go in and look at the actual language. We could go dig into the Greek and see exactly what, you know, what some of the earliest manuscripts say and what words are there. We're not going to do that today. But if you ever, though, this is a good piece of advice, though. If you ever want to, if you're ever trying to study the Bible and you want to see the places that even scholars may not be sure what the person's trying to say, if you read about 3 different good translations next to each other, any places where the words are quite different, you can be like, oh, that's somewhere that they screwed up, that they don't know what to do. And you can go and you can look online and be like, let me see that passage in Greek, and it'll show you the Greek and the English, and it'll actually show you kind of the words that are there and what the closest meaning might be. Because translators do have to kind of take this stuff and make it fit into English, you know, and so
just the differences, the way the word may have been used elsewhere in the Bible.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and also there are books out there that help you study that stuff too if you're really into it. But a lot of people aren't really into it. So, but
that's so cool, and that's what I like so much about this science series. Like in Hebrew, it means this, and we don't even have a word for that in English. We're like, oh, I didn't know that, but I would like to know that.
Yep. Well, there are resources that will show you that kind of stuff, and so if you ever need to know any, let me know, and I'll get you some. So yeah, so Matthew, we have wronged you. So which of these do you like better?
I haven't gone back to look at the verses in Matthew in context of where they're sitting, but are they given to different audiences?
Well, let's go back and look. Do you have your Bible open? Go back and look. Go back to Matthew 6, 9 through 13. would say to you, Bill, is that in this section in Matthew, basically what's going on here is a little different in that even though Luke has a lot of teachings in it, Luke's teachings are wrapped up in lots of parables and lots of encounters with people. In the book of Matthew, in this section, you get this whole list of just teachings. I mean, just Jesus just talking. So you start in chapter 5 with the Beatitudes. Does anybody know what the Beatitudes are? It's the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. That's 5. And then he keeps teaching about, if you just look at the headings, he teaches about salt and light, the law and the prophets, concerning anger, concerning adultery, concerning divorce, concerning oaths, concerning retaliation, love for your enemies, concerning almsgiving. And then, when you pray, this is what you do.
It's two different audiences.
Yeah, it's kind of two different audiences and two kind of different, even two different contexts in what's going on here. It's not as, the way Matthew portrays it is part of a long list of teachings. In the Luke story, it arises a little more organically from the travel narrative. This is one of the beautiful things about the way that the Gospels were preserved, though, is that the people that thought about what do we keep in the Bible way back a long time ago. Now, see, some people, it really bothers them that there were a group of people that sat down and said, what do we keep in the Bible and what don't we? I love the fact that the people that did that said, we're going to keep 4 stories about Jesus that don't all agree with one another. Because they give us different insights into how people experience Jesus, what Jesus was up to. They give us different ways to think about how people are thinking about Jesus. All of those different things. And so it's actually a beautiful thing that in the book of Matthew it shows up in a completely different context in a completely different way. For our purposes in the book of Luke, it shows up as part of this journey to Jerusalem, as people are really trying to decide and figure out, how do we follow you? How can we be your followers? And so that's the very specific context. So any thoughts on whether you like one or the other better, or would you have to think about that for a while?
I like Matthew better.
Why do you like Matthew better?
It's just more similar to I went to Catholic schools. It's much more similar to what we learned, starting from kindergarten on and said every day.
Yeah,
so
it's like
comforting, I guess.
It's there. It's comforting. It's what I know. It feels right. Yeah, yeah. And there's, you know what? And that's okay. There's something good about that familiarity sometimes. So as long as it doesn't become rote, like Katie was talking about earlier, right? Where it becomes stale and stagnant.
I always just like,
Uh-huh.
almost kind of the opposite of what you're saying, how you like the Gospels to have different perspectives. I always appreciate when they do kind of align, because it's a confirmation that more than one person heard the same thing, and so it just makes me feel like, oh, that happened, because more than one person is saying the same thing. Instead of we just hear it from one person, you're like, well, again, he said so, I guess, I don't know.
Yeah.
But when it all kind of correlates, it gives me comfort to know, okay, 4 people heard Jesus say this one thing, maybe in a different way, but they heard it.
And that can be nice. That can be somewhat comforting to see those parallels, to see where it lines up. I would say this though. Is there a story that your family tells all the time about something that happened? Okay. Does anybody tell it the same way?
I always tell it right.
Okay, you always tell it right. Exactly. You always tell it right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. There's stories like that in my family. There's one that my mom and I still fight over to this day, and we both agree not to say to the other one that we were right, but we know we're right. So that also, in some ways, to me, gives me comfort that these are real people wrestling with a real thing. Because also, if you were to sit down and the 4 of us were just to write about what happened in class today, it would look totally different. And there would be similarities, but it would not all line up together. It wouldn't all be one for one. And then these people too are building on different tellings, right? They're building on different resources. So for instance, in the book of Mark, most scholars think came first. And so some of the things from the book of Mark inform some of the ways that the other Gospels were told, or at least that Matthew and Luke were told. John is this strange thing that's almost completely its own. John is almost 90% its own material, and it's like it's the black sheep of the family when it comes to the Gospels. It's a bit different. It's an interesting thing there that sometimes they don't always line up. So if you had to identify, though, if you looked at that prayer, what would you say are the movements of the prayer, or the main things that are focused on?
You mean
What comes first?
Who you're communing with.
Who you're communing with, they said? Right, yeah. Who we're communing with. So we've got basically this holiness of the Lord's name, right? Great. What comes next? What would you say?
Verbatim, bring in your kingdom.
That's right. So kingdom. So who are we communicating with? We are communicating with God when we pray the Lord's Prayer. The God that we know in Jesus Christ. But then we are talking about the kingdom. And we're talking about whatever it means for God's power to reign in our time, in our lives, and then also reign forevermore and bring in whatever this new kingdom is. So that would be the second thing. What's the third thing?
Asking for something.
Okay, what do you ask for?
Bread.
Yes, you ask for bread. What does that say to you, asking for bread?
It's important to eat.
Okay, yeah, important to eat.
You need food. Nourishment.
Or just that your basic needs are met.
Okay, could be basic needs.
something I just noticed is we need for today. It's not like a long-term goal, it's in the moment.
Yeah, today, right? Yeah, our daily bread. That each and every day we need nourishment from God. Now that may take the form of these basic needs, but bread we know is symbolic throughout the Bible for the giving goodness of God. You know, from the earliest parts of the Old Testament where the Israelites are wandering through the desert and manna, bread falls from heaven, basically. You know, this bread, what does it mean to get nourished daily by God? And you know, I'm really glad you pointed that, because that's another thing that happens to the Israelites in the wilderness. They are told, don't gather more of the manna than you can eat in one day because it will go bad. And there's an episode where they actually gather too much, because they think, oh, we're going to gather it all, we're going to be greedy, we're going to get it all, you know. So, and who could blame them for being greedy? I mean, they're in the wilderness, right? But it molds, it goes bad. So in some ways, nourishment taken not daily can go bad in some ways. And so, yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that out. So daily bread.
Well, there's also, I just thought of this now, but if he's setting his disciples up and the progeny up for like a continued discussion path with God, and he's putting in the middle of it, give us the bread. He's using bread specifically, and then not a few days later, he's talking about, or I don't know, time, like weeks, whatever it is. He is the bread, and he talks to them about, I am the bread. So he's calling upon that exact language.
Yes.
So now we're not just talking about sustenance, but we're talking about Jesus himself.
Yeah. And Jesus does that, you know, and some of that language gets really pretty in the book of John, which is so different. But some of that living water language and bread, all these things, you know, they take on this real life. That what does it mean to look to God for that kind of real nourishment? So what's the next movement in the prayer then? So we've got who we're communing with, we've got kingdom, ask for bread, and forgiveness. Yes, forgiveness of wrongs or sins. Why is forgiveness important as a part of prayer, do you think?
Is it part of that idea that we all sinned and every day, and so acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, acknowledgement of where we still lack. Okay, great, acknowledgement. Thank you. And then what's the last movement? Last part, what is it?
Well, on the forgiveness too, it's like forgive us, but also forgive others.
That's right. Forgive us, forgive others.
It's not, yeah.
So it's not just about us. It's not a petition just for me. It's a petition for all of us together. And then what's the last move?
Temptation from evil.
That's right, yeah. Protect us from temptation. Temptation. We know that leading up to Jesus' own journey into, ministry, some of the Gospels tell us about his journey into the wilderness that prepares him for that, where he is tempted himself. And so what does it mean for us to pray daily for our daily bread and to be asked to be saved from our temptations, so to speak?
But can I ask you a question
Yeah.
about that? So they're both similar in the way they say that. It's don't lead us to temptation. This part always confused me. I remember thinking as a kid, wouldn't I be leading myself to I don't know.
That's
Why
a
is
great.
it putting the onus on God?
That's a great question, and
don't make me sin, dude.
I'm trying to remember what the wording is there. I'm going to have to go and look back on that for you. I did read something. I was reading about that recently, though, and I don't remember. It might have been in the book that I was reading called God Can't. That is a theologian trying to talk about how he thinks God actually works in the world, and he said he does not believe in a testing God,
Right.
and so he said that kind of language for him would be really troublesome.
Yeah.
And so so what do we do with that? Don't lead me into temptation. I'll go and dig into that some more and look into that for you. So if I can remember to do that, I'll dig into that a bit and see.
So just because I was reading that recently,
go for it.
The Catholic Church is actually changing that.
Maybe that's where I read about it.
The Pope sat in the chair and said the thing or did whatever a Pope does and changed the words to do not allow us to fall into temptation.
Right.
For exactly this reason. And there was a long theological document about how it's not impossible for God to intentionally lead us to temptation, but that's not what we encounter most of the time. Most of the time we encounter our own interactions with the world or the world's interactions with us.
Right.
That,
that next line, rescue us from the evil one, then Matthew's version, I guess, is sort of putting the blame, it's the evil one. It's
right.
I don't know.
That's interesting to me because I've always and deliver us from evil. And to me, that was a big, all-encompassing evil.
Yeah.
That could be anything.
Yeah.
But the evil one is it's so much more specific.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, also the New Testament has echoes of things that have been going on all the way through as well. You kind of start to get this. There was no well-developed notion of the devil or Satan in the Old Testament, really. But in the book of Job, you get one of these times where God is asked by the accuser, or Hasatan, which sounds a lot like Satan, right? Hasatan, and it says to God, your servant Job is the best person on the planet, but if he actually were to be challenged, if he were to suffer, he would not believe anymore, And so there's this kind of idea running through all of our scripture that there is this, there is a malevolent force anyway that can tempt us away from God. Now the guy I was reading would say that God would never lead people in because he doesn't believe that's how God can work. But those are things. Those are little things that you have to debate. You have to think about and wrestle with. And I was going to ask you to spend a little time on how this might apply to the life of a disciple today. We don't have time for that because y'all did such a great job of discussing. But so what I would challenge you to do is think a little bit, either today, if you haven't been to the service yet, or next time you're in the service and we say the Lord's Prayer, or maybe take the Lord's Prayer home and pray it yourselves, at home at some point, and think about what this kind of movement of prayer that Jesus gives his disciples as they start this journey to Jerusalem, what it might have to speak into your own life. And then also wrestle with some of those challenges that are in there, like the thing you just mentioned. Wrestle with what is that? What is the nature of temptation? What is the nature of my sinfulness? What is the nature of needing to be forgiven? What is the nature of God's kingdom? And what does it mean to call God holy and reigning over all of us? So, does anybody have any prayer concerns or anything we need to know about today?
We lost his great aunt at 92. And it was a blessing, like the whole process of her expiration was really, it was like well done, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, God took care of everybody in the process. Her, us, the goodbyes that were necessary, etc. But of course there's the fallout, you know, the families that are sad and missing, and we'll just pray for comfort and strength and all of the usuals, and the passing of a beloved great aunt and grandmother.
Thanks for sharing. Anything else we need to know about? Yeah.
My dad had surgery and then a follow-up emergency surgery last week, and so he is recovering slowly but surely. So just all that. Yeah.
Prayers for Sammy. All right. Anyone else? All right. Well, it would not make any more sense for us to close than to close the Lord's Prayer. So let's say that together. Can we do that? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. All right, great to see y'all this week. See you next week. Actually, next week is the thing upstairs. So we'll all be upstairs next week for the town hall.